Still clinging to him, I see.
Your son is broken and you know it. But he made one fatal mistake, I understand him.
And you're underestimating this room.
The words sliced through the golden phoenix like a blade through silk. Sharp and unforgiving. The kind of statement that makes time stop and breath catch in collective throats. Every head in the restaurant turned toward table 7 where Victor Donovan stood with a wine glass, dangling from his fingers, staring down at the young man seated across from him. His own flesh and blood, with the kind of disgust most people reserve for something they've scraped off their shoe. The boy, Daniel, couldn't hear the insult. He was deaf, had been since birth, lived his entire 24 years in a world of silence that his father had never bothered trying to understand. But Daniel could read faces better than most people read books, and what he saw etched across Victor's features was worse than any words could ever convey. If you've ever witnessed something so shocking it made you question humanity itself, you know exactly what everyone in that room was feeling right now. That urgent need to tell someone about it, to share this moment with others who'd understand the weight of what they were seeing. Let's rewind 12 hours, back to when the day was young and the evening's devastation was still just a seed waiting to sprout. Victor Donovan woke up at 5:30 in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, the kind of real estate that cost more per square foot than most Americans earn in a year. His morning routine was military in its precision. 45 minutes of cardio, protein shake with exactly 28 grams of powder, 15 minutes scanning Bloomberg terminals, while his assistant laid out his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. Victor wasn't just successful, he was obscenely, offensively rich. The kind of wealthy that made Forbes list editors double-check their calculations. Real estate mogul, venture capitalist. The man who turned a single Brooklyn apartment building into an empire spanning 3 states and 2 countries. And if you think this story is heading somewhere predictable, you haven't seen anything yet. What happens next will make you want to discuss it with everyone you know to spread the word about what unfolds when arrogance meets its reckoning. His crown jewel was the Golden Phoenix, an upscale restaurant in downtown Manhattan where reservations were booked 6 months in advance, and the cheapest entree cost more than a car payment. Crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna hung like frozen waterfalls, above tables draped in Italian linen, each place setting featuring silverware that could fund a semester of college tuition. The wine cellar held vintages older than most of the staff, and the kitchen was run by Chef Ricardo Martinez, a Michelin-starred genius, who Victor paid obscene amounts to maintain the restaurant's reputation as Manhattan's premier dining destination. But here's what the glossy magazine profiles never mentioned, what Victor's carefully curated public image conveniently omitted. And trust me, you'll want to know this part, because it reveals everything about the kind of man he really was, the kind of truth that makes you appreciate authentic stories when you find them. Victor had built his empire on ruthlessness, on making sure everyone around him understood exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. Beneath him, always beneath him. Control was Victor's religion, and he practiced it with the devotion of a monk. What the business magazines also didn't mention was that his personal life was a disaster, wrapped in designer clothes and expensive cologne. 3 marriages, each ending in divorce settlements that would make most people faint, and 1 son, Daniel, from his second wife, a woman named Catherine, who had the audacity to leave Victor when he suggested they institutionalize their deaf infant. Catherine had taken Daniel and raised him properly, taught him American Sign Language, connected him with the deaf community, gave him the foundation to become the brilliant, compassionate young man he was today. And if you're already feeling that familiar anger rising in your chest, that sense that someone needs to stand up and say something about fathers like Victor, well, you're not alone, and there are others out there who feel exactly the same way you do right now. Tonight's dinner invitation had come 3 weeks ago, a formal email from Victor's assistant to Daniel's inbox. Your father requests your presence for dinner at the Golden Phoenix on November 12th at 8:30 p.m. Business casual attire. Our SVP required. No warmth, no personal touch, just the cold efficiency of a calendar appointment. Daniel had stared at that email for 2 days before responding, his stomach churning with the familiar cocktail of hope and dread that always accompanied interactions with his father. But Daniel had responded anyway, typed out a polite acceptance, because despite everything, he was still his father's son, still carrying that primal human need for parental approval even when you know rationally that it's never coming. This moment right here, this decision Daniel made, is the kind of thing that makes you think about your own relationships, about the stories. We all carry the kind of reflection that deserves to be voiced in spaces where real conversations happen. Victor's motivations for tonight's dinner were, as usual, self-serving. His PR team had been suggesting for months that he needed to humanize his brand, show the public a softer side, maybe do some interviews about balancing career and family. And what better way to demonstrate his evolved, compassionate side than having dinner with his disabled son? Victor could practically see the headlines, the photo opportunities, the way this would play on social media, because men like Victor understand engagement, understand visibility, understand that the more people see something, the more real it becomes. But Victor had also planned something else for tonight, something his PR team definitely wouldn't approve of. He wanted to teach Daniel a lesson, wanted to prove once and for all that accommodating disability was impractical, that the real world didn't bend for people who were different. And if that sounds like the setup for something explosive, something that'll make you feel things you didn't expect, you're absolutely right, and you'll want to stay connected to see how this unfolds. The Golden Phoenix staff arrived at 3 in the afternoon for prep work, a small army of servers, cooks, bartenders, and bussers who made the magic happen while people like Victor took the credit. Among them was Sophie Chen, 31 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen more grief than anyone that young should carry. Sophie had been working at the Golden Phoenix for 4 years, always punctual, always professional, always so invisible that most regular customers couldn't have picked her out of a lineup. Nobody knew her story. Nobody asked. What they didn't know, what Sophie had buried so deep it almost felt like someone else's memory, was that 4 years ago she'd been a certified medical interpreter, fluent in American Sign Language since childhood, one of the most sought-after interpreters on the East Coast. But that was before Marcus, before the accident, before grief carved her insides out and left her searching for any job that didn't require her to use the language that reminded her of everything she'd lost. This is the kind of backstory that changes everything. The kind of detail that makes you realize this isn't just any story. It's the kind that needs to be passed along to people who appreciate depth and meaning. Working at the Golden Phoenix was supposed to be temporary, a placeholder while she figured out what came next. 4 years later, she was still there, still hiding, still running from a truth that was about to catch up with her in the most unexpected way possible. Because tonight, Victor Donovan's carefully planned humiliation was going to backfire spectacularly. And the invisible waitress he'd never bothered noticing was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. The shadows were about to meet the light, and what emerged from that collision would prove that truth always finds a way, especially when someone finally has the courage to let it speak. And if you're feeling that pull, that sense that you need to see where this goes, that you want to be part of the community that witnesses what happens when compassion confronts cruelty, well, that instinct is telling you something important about the kind of content that matters, the kind of journey worth following all the way to its powerful conclusion. Sophie Chen had become a master of the invisible art. Not magic, not sleight of hand, but something far more practical and infinitely sadder. The art of making yourself so unremarkable, so forgettable, so perfectly bland that people's eyes slide right past you like water off glass. She'd perfected the neutral smile, the efficient movements, the way of occupying space without actually taking up any room. In 4 years at the Golden Phoenix, she'd served thousands of meals to hundreds of customers, and maybe 5 of them could have picked her out of a lineup. That wasn't accident. That was design, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, because invisibility is a choice you make when being seen feels more dangerous than disappearing. But here's the thing about hiding. It only works until someone finally notices you. And when they do, you'll want every person who understands grief and survival to witness what happens next. To be there when the invisible finally becomes undeniable. Rewind 5 years. Back when Sophie Chen wore her real identity on her sleeve instead of burying it beneath polyester uniforms and forced pleasantries. Back then, she wasn't serving cocktails to Manhattan's elite. She was standing in hospital operating rooms, emergency departments, psychiatric consultations, her hands moving with the precision of a concert pianist translating life and death conversations. Certified medical interpreter, licensed in 3 states, fluent in American Sign Language since she was 7 years old. Dr. Rodriguez would be explaining complex surgical procedures to deaf patients, and Sophie's hands would transform medical jargon into visual poetry, her facial expressions adding grammatical nuance that gave meaning to every gesture. She was exceptional at it, the kind of interpreter that doctors specifically requested, that patients asked for by name, that hospital administrators proudly mentioned during diversity presentations. At 26, she was already being courted by major medical centers across the country, building a career that felt less like work and more like calling. This is the kind of transformation story that resonates with anyone who has ever had to rebuild themselves from scratch, the kind that makes you reflect on your own journey and want to hear from others who've walked similar paths. The reason was simple, beautiful, and ultimately heartbreaking. Sophie learned ASL from Marcus, her older brother by 3 years, born profoundly deaf in a hearing family that struggled with what that meant. Their parents were first-generation immigrants from Taiwan, brilliant engineers who understood circuit boards and differential equations, but couldn't wrap their heads around why their son's ears didn't work. They loved Marcus, sure, but their love came wrapped in grief, in this constant mourning for the normal child they thought they'd lost. They dragged him to audiologists and speech therapists, investigating cochlear implants and experimental treatments, always searching for a fix instead of acceptance. Sophie was 7 when she realized her parents were asking the wrong questions. They kept asking, how do we make Marcus hear, when they should have been asking, how do we learn to listen? So she took matters into her own small hands, checked out library books on sign language, connected with deaf community resources, threw herself into learning ASL with the single-minded determination that makes you want to tell everyone you know about the power of choosing love over convenience. By the time Sophie was 12, she was fluent. By 16, she was interpreting professionally. By 20, she'd moved to Manhattan specifically to be closer to Marcus, who'd gotten accepted into Pratt Institute for graphic design. They were inseparable, those two. Marcus used to joke that Sophie was his voice, but that wasn't quite accurate. She wasn't his voice. She was his bridge to a world that refused to meet him halfway, that insisted he adapt instead of making room for difference. Marcus didn't need fixing. Marcus was brilliant, funny, compassionate, and devastatingly talented. His design work spoke louder than words ever could. Visual compositions that won awards and landed major clients. He had a boyfriend named James who was also deaf, a physical therapist who worked at NYU Hospital. They'd been together for 4 years, planning to get married, looking at apartments in Brooklyn where the deaf community was thriving. Marcus had dreams, concrete plans, a future that stretched out bright and full of possibility. And if you're already feeling that connection to their story, that sense that relationships like these deserve to be celebrated and remembered, you're tapping into something universal, something that connects us all when we allow ourselves to really see each other. Then came that Tuesday afternoon in March, the one that divided Sophie's life into before and after, the one that taught her that some truths are so devastating they split you in half. It was March 15th, a Tuesday that started ordinary and ended in devastation. Marcus had been crossing Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg, right by that little coffee shop he loved, the one with the elaborate latte art and the barista who'd learned to sign good morning just for him. He had his phone out, checking a text message Sophie had sent, some stupid meme about impossible client requests that designers dealt with. Security footage from a nearby bodega showed him smiling, his whole face lit up with that laugh Sophie knew so well, completely unaware that a delivery truck was running a red light at 40 miles per hour. Marcus never heard it coming. The driver had been texting too, distracted by his own phone. Never saw the pedestrian in the crosswalk until it was far too late. The impact killed Marcus instantly, his body thrown 30 feet, his phone skittering across the pavement, still showing Sophie's message on the cracked screen. This is the kind of moment that makes you want to reach out to the people you care about, to let them know they matter, to build connections before it's too late. What came after was a blur of grief so profound it had its own gravity, pulling everything into its black hole. Funeral arrangements made in a fog of shock, condolence cards that meant nothing from people who meant well, James sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe, signing YYY over and over until his hands were shaking too badly to form the words, their parents flying in from California, finally learning to sign I love you, and I am sorry at their son's memorial service, too late for the words to matter. Sophie remembered standing at the funeral, watching the interpreter translate the eulogy she'd written, and feeling something break inside her that she knew would never heal properly. Every word in ASL reminded her of Marcus. Every sign was a ghost, a phantom limb, a presence that had been amputated from her life without anesthesia or warning. The truth was unbearable. Marcus died looking at her message. Died because she'd texted instead of called. Died in a world that accommodated hearing people as distractions, but never protected deaf people as vulnerabilities. Stories like this need voices to carry them forward. People willing to amplify the message that our choices matter, and our attention can literally save lives. Sophie tried to go back to interpreting after the funeral. Lasted exactly 3 weeks, before she had a breakdown in the middle of translating an emergency appendectomy consultation. The patient was a deaf teenager, same age Marcus had been when Sophie first learned to sign, and when she saw his hands moving, asking scared questions about the surgery, something in her snapped. She excused herself, walked out of the hospital, and never went back, deleted her professional profiles, ignored calls from former colleagues, let her certifications lapse. She needed to disappear, needed to find work that didn't require ASL, that didn't remind her every single day of what she'd lost. The Golden Phoenix hired her with barely an interview. Upscale restaurants were always desperate for reliable staff, and Sophie's ability to smile through pain made her perfect for customer service. 4 years later, she was still there, still hiding in plain sight, still running from the truth that grief demands to be felt, not avoided. But tonight was going to change everything, and you'll want to stay tuned to see how hiding ends and healing finally begins. Victor Donovan's cruelty was about to give Sophie something she didn't know she needed, a reason to step back into the light and remember why she'd learned this beautiful, complex, profoundly human language in the first place. The shadows were about to dissolve, the truth was about to emerge, and Sophie Chen was about to discover that sometimes the universe doesn't ask permission before throwing you back into the fire. It just decides you've been hiding long enough, and when that moment comes, when someone finally stands up and uses their pain as power, it creates the kind of ripple effect that reaches far beyond one restaurant, one night, one family. It becomes something larger, something worth being part of, something that reminds us all why stories of redemption and courage need communities to witness them and carry them forward into the world. Daniel Donovan walked into the Golden Phoenix at exactly 8:30, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Not because of him. He carried himself with quiet dignity, dressed in a well-fitted navy suit that his mother had helped him pick out, moving through the restaurant with the careful awareness of someone who spent a lifetime navigating spaces designed for people unlike him. No, the chill came from Victor, who watched his son's entrance from table 7 with the expression of a man preparing to perform surgery without anesthesia, all precision and zero compassion. The other diners sensed it immediately, that electric tension that makes people stop mid-conversation and lean slightly toward the drama. Unfolding 3 tables over, something was brewing, something uncomfortable and messy, and you could feel it in the air. The kind of moment that makes you wish you had someone to process it with later, to talk through what you were witnessing, and what it means about the world we were living in. Daniel spotted his father immediately, and began making his way through the maze of tables, his movements deliberate and careful. He'd learned through hard experience to navigate restaurants like minefields, always conscious that his deafness made him vulnerable to the chaos of waiters rushing past, with hot plates, chairs scraping, without warning the thousand ambient sounds that hearing people unconsciously use to orient themselves in space. When he reached table 7, he caught his father's eye and signed a simple, respectful greeting. "Hello, Father. Thank you for the invitation." His hands moving with the fluid grace that comes from a lifetime of using American Sign Language as your primary mode of communication. Victor stared at those moving hands like they were insects crawling across the white tablecloth, then deliberately turned his head away and raised his hand to summon a server. The dismissiveness was so casual, so practiced, that it made you want to stand up and say something, to be the voice for people who deserve better than silence in the face of cruelty. "You," Victor called out, his voice cutting through the ambient restaurant noise like a knife through butter. "The Asian one, come here." Now, the words were casual, dismissive, the tone of someone who never considered that other people might have names or dignity, or reasons to be treated with basic respect. Sophie felt her entire body go cold, that fight-or-flight response kicking in as she finished taking an order, and made her way toward table 7 on legs that suddenly felt made of concrete. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run, to fake an emergency, to do anything except walk into whatever trap Victor Donovan was setting. But you don't run when men like Victor summon you. Not if you need your job. Not if you've built your entire life around staying invisible. This is the kind of injustice that makes you appreciate spaces where people call out abuse when they see it, where communities form around protecting the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. "What's your name?" Victor asked, though his tone made it abundantly clear he didn't actually care about the answer. "Sophie, sir," she replied, keeping her expression professionally neutral, her voice carefully modulated. Victor looked her up and down with the kind of assessment you'd give livestock at auction, then glanced at Daniel, who had seated himself and was now studying the menu with forced concentration, clearly trying to make himself smaller. "My son here has a situation," Victor began, and Sophie felt her stomach clench with anticipatory dread. "He's deaf. Can't hear a damn thing. Born that way, unfortunately. And he insists on using those ridiculous hand gestures instead of learning to read lips like a normal person, like someone who actually wants to function in society." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't look up, didn't react, didn't give his father the satisfaction. This was the kind of moment that needed witnesses, people willing to remember what they saw and ensure that truth doesn't get buried under polite silence. "So here's what we're going to do," Victor continued, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Sophie, is it? I'm going to make tonight interesting. You're going to serve my son using only sign language. No speaking, no writing things down, no charades or pointing or any other cheating. Just those hand movements he's so attached to. For the entire dinner service, every course, every drink refill, every interaction." The restaurant had gone noticeably quieter now, conversations trailing off as people at neighboring tables tuned into the spectacle at table 7, their food forgotten as they leaned in to hear what came next. Victor was enjoying this, Sophie realized with growing horror. He'd positioned himself at the most visible table specifically so people would watch, so his cruelty would have an audience. And if you're feeling that rising indignation, that sense that stories like this need to spread so people understand what discrimination actually looks like, that instinct is exactly what drives change in the world. And here's the part that makes it worth your while, Victor said, his smile sharpening into something that looked more like a wolf baring its teeth. "If you manage to successfully serve my son using only sign language for the entire meal, appetizers, entrees, dessert, the whole 9 yards, I will personally give you $100,000, cash, tax-free." The number detonated in the room like a bomb, rippling outward in gasps and whispers. $100,000. That was more money than Sophie had made in the last 3 years combined. More than enough to change her life completely. People at neighboring tables were exchanging glances, some shocked, others envious, all of them absolutely captivated by the drama unfolding in real time. This was the kind of proposition that makes you lean forward in your seat, that makes you want to grab the person next to you and say, "Are you seeing this?" The kind of moment that deserves to be discussed and dissected by people who care about justice and dignity. "But," he continued, drawing out the word like a conductor preparing for a crescendo, "if you fail, if you have to speak even one single word, if you mess up even one order, if you break the rules in any way, you're fired. Immediately. Security will escort you out, and before you leave my restaurant you'll stand right here in front of everyone and announce that sign language is useless, that it's a crutch for people who refuse to adapt to the real world, that accommodating disability is impractical and unreasonable." The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, truth and lies tangling together in the silence that followed. This wasn't just a bet, this was psychological warfare, a public demonstration of Victor's worldview, that some people matter and others don't, that difference equals deficiency, and if that makes your blood boil, if it makes you think about all the times you've witnessed injustice, and wished someone would finally stand up, then you understand why moments like these need witnesses who will carry the truth forward. Sophie looked at Daniel, really looked at him for the first time, and what she saw broke something open in her chest. He was staring at his father with an expression she recognized from every mirror she'd looked into for the past 5 years. Not anger, not even surprise, just bone-deep resignation. The look of someone who'd been wounded so many times the knife barely registered anymore. This was Victor's idea of parenting, his twisted version of tough love, his delusional belief that public humiliation would somehow motivate his son to stop being deaf. But what Victor saw as weakness, Daniel's deafness, his use of ASL, his refusal to pretend, Sophie recognized as extraordinary strength. Daniel had survived 24 years with this man as his father and still showed up, still maintained his dignity, still had the courage to keep trying. That kind of resilience deserves recognition, the kind that makes you want to be part of communities that celebrate strength in all its forms. The truth settled over Sophie like a physical weight. This moment was a crossroads. She could decline politely, mumble some excuse, go back to being invisible and let Daniel suffer another humiliation. That was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that 4 years of grief had trained her to make. Or she could flip the script entirely, could step out of the shadows she'd been hiding in, could use the very skills she'd been running from to prove that Victor's cruelty was built on ignorance. The second option was dangerous, terrifying, a potential disaster. But standing there, Watching Daniel try to make himself smaller while his father plotted his humiliation, Sophie realized something. Some truths demand to be spoken, and some shadows need light. Sophie took a deep breath, stood straighter, looked Victor directly in his smug eyes, and said clearly, "I accept your challenge, Mr. Donovan." The restaurant erupted in murmurs. Victor grinned, certain he'd trapped this nobody waitress. Daniel looked up, confused, and Sophie turned to him and signed with perfect fluency, "Don't worry, I understand you, and I've got this." The shock on Daniel's face was immediate, and Victor's realization that he might have just become the prey instead of the hunter, that was something you'll want to see unfold, something that proves revenge isn't nearly as powerful as truth. When it finally emerges from its shadows, the silence in the Golden Phoenix was deafening. Every fork had stopped mid-air. Every conversation had died mid-sentence. Every eye was fixed on table 7 where Sophie Chen stood with her hands raised, about to do something that would change everything. Daniel looked at her with a mixture of confusion and hope. The kind of expression you see on someone who has been drowning so long they've forgotten what air tastes like. Victor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he'd already won. But here's what Victor didn't understand about truth. It doesn't need permission to speak, and it sure as hell doesn't care about your ego. Sophie's hands began to move, and what happened next was like watching poetry written in motion. The kind of moment that makes you want to capture it and show it to everyone. Who has ever doubted the power of choosing compassion over cruelty? "Good evening, Daniel. My name is Sophie, and I'll be your server tonight." Her hands flowed through the signs with such natural fluency that Daniel's eyes widened in genuine shock. This wasn't someone who'd learned a few basic phrases from YouTube videos. This was a native signer, someone who understood that ASL wasn't just hand gestures. It was facial expressions, body language, spatial awareness, a complete linguistic system as complex and beautiful as any spoken language. Sophie continued, "Our specials tonight include a pan-seared Chilean sea bass with lemon butter reduction, a dry-aged ribeye with truffle compound butter, and a vegetarian risotto with wild mushrooms and aged parmesan. Can I start you with something to drink?" She signed it all perfectly, her face animated with the grammatical expressions that give ASL its meaning, her movements fluid and confident. Daniel's response came immediately, his hands moving fast, now excited. And if you've ever witnessed two people connecting across a bridge that others said was impossible to build, you know exactly why moments like this deserve to be remembered and passed along to others who need hope. Victor's face was transitioning through stages of emotion like a malfunctioning traffic light. Confusion, suspicion, and then something darker, something that looked a lot like fear. Because this wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Sophie was supposed to fumble, to embarrass herself trying to communicate with Daniel, to prove Victor's point that accommodating disability was impractical and unnecessary. Instead, she was demonstrating exactly the opposite, that the barrier wasn't Daniel's deafness, it was everyone else's ignorance. Daniel signed again, faster now, his movements containing an energy that had been absent when he first walked in. "What's your sign name? How long have you been signing? Where did you learn?" Sophie's hands danced through her responses, explaining briefly about Marcus, about her years as an interpreter, about the deaf community she'd been part of. With each answer, Daniel's posture changed, his shoulders straightened, his smile grew. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he looked like someone who belonged, someone who mattered, someone who was truly seen. This is the kind of transformation that makes you reflect on your own assumptions, the kind that deserves voices willing to amplify the message that inclusion isn't just possible, it's powerful. The other diners were leaning in now, some holding up phones to record, others whispering translations to their companions, trying to explain what they were witnessing. A woman at table 4 started crying, though she probably couldn't have explained why. Sometimes you see something so unexpected, so pure in its humanity, that it cracks open something in your chest you didn't know was closed. This was one of those moments, the kind that spreads through communities when people decide it's worth sharing. When they recognize that some stories transcend entertainment and become something closer to testimony. Sophie took Daniel's drink order, sparkling water with lime, and then did something that made the entire restaurant gasp. She signed, with perfect fluency, a joke, a complicated, contextual joke about a deaf man walking into a restaurant and being surprised by competent service. Daniel's laughter was silent, but explosive, his whole body shaking with genuine joy. And suddenly table 7 wasn't a spectacle of humiliation anymore. It was an island of connection in a room full of strangers, a demonstration that communication isn't about sound, it's about willingness. Victor tried to interrupt, his voice sharp. Very impressive, but let's see if you can actually take his order without screwing it up. Sophie didn't even look at him. She kept her attention on Daniel, kept the conversation flowing, and in doing so, made Victor irrelevant. And isn't that what bullies fear most? Not confrontation, but insignificance. Being ignored is worse than being challenged because it reveals the truth they've been hiding from. That their power is just smoke and mirrors. That their control is an illusion maintained only by everyone's willingness to play along. Sophie wasn't playing along anymore, and if you've ever watched someone finally stand up to the person who has been tormenting them, you know exactly why this moment needs to be discussed with people who understand that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply refusing to acknowledge its authority. Daniel ordered the sea bass, asked questions about preparation in rapid ASL, made a comment about preferring his vegetables steamed rather than sautéed. Sophie caught every detail, her hands confirming each point, her face showing understanding and respect. The whole exchange took maybe 3 minutes, but in that time, something fundamental shifted. The truth emerged from its shadows, and everyone in the Golden Phoenix could feel it. Victor Donovan, the man who controlled everything, couldn't control this. His son, the one he'd called broken, was whole. His plan to humiliate had backfired spectacularly, and the invisible waitress he'd dismissed without a second thought was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. This wasn't about revenge. It was about something pure. Something that happens when truth finally gets tired of hiding in shadows and decides to stand in the light where everyone can see it. Around the restaurant, phones were recording, social media was lighting up, and something bigger was beginning. A businessman at table 12 signed thank you to Daniel, clumsy but sincere. A teenager asked her parents if they could learn sign language as a family. The bartender, Mike, was furiously Googling ASL classes near me on his phone. Sophie had done more than win a challenge or prove a point. She'd opened a door that had been locked for too long, shown a room full of privileged diners, that their comfort wasn't more important than someone else's dignity, that the world didn't have to be the way Victor insisted it was. And if you're feeling that shift too, that sense that you want to be part of spaces where stories like this are told and read, where communities form around the belief that everyone deserves to be seen and heard in whatever language they speak, then you're already understanding why this story matters. Why it needs to reach beyond one restaurant on one night. Why truth always finds its audience when people decide it as worth carrying forward into a world that desperately needs to hear it. Victor Donovan's face was doing something it hadn't done in decades, showing genuine emotion he couldn't control. His jaw clenched and unclenched like a broken mechanism, his knuckles white around the stem of his wine glass, his eyes darting between Sophie and Daniel with the frantic energy of someone watching their empire crumble in real time. See, powerful men like Victor spend their whole lives building walls, constructing elaborate defenses to protect themselves from ever feeling small or vulnerable or wrong. But those walls can't protect you from the truth. And tonight, truth had walked right through his fortress wearing a waitress uniform and speaking a language he'd spent 24 years dismissing as worthless. The other diners weren't even pretending to focus on their own meals anymore. Table 7 had become the main event, and Victor was no longer the director of this show. He was the villain, exposed under bright lights for everyone to judge. And if you've ever witnessed someone's carefully constructed facade finally crack, you know exactly why moments like this resonate so deeply, why they become the stories people need to process together with others who understand that justice sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways. Sophie returned from the kitchen carrying Daniel's appetizer, seared scallops, with a citrus reduction, and the way she presented it made the whole interaction look like art. She placed the plate down with practiced precision, then signed a detailed description of each component, explaining the preparation method, asking if he needed anything else, treating him with the kind of respect that should be automatic but somehow felt revolutionary in this context. Daniel signed back enthusiastically, complimenting the presentation, asking about the chef's background, engaging in the kind of casual conversation that hearing diners take for granted, but that he'd been denied his entire life in establishments like this. And all the while, Victor sat there like a statue made of rage and embarrassment, forced to watch his broken son communicate more effectively than he ever had. The universe has this beautiful way of serving irony, of making sure that the lessons we need most come wrapped in the exact humiliation we tried to inflict on others. This is the kind of poetic justice that makes you want to share it with everyone in your circle. to discuss how karma works when we least expect it. The whispers started spreading through the restaurant like wildfire. Did you see that? She's fluent in sign language. The son looks so happy. What kind of father would do that to his own kid? The court of public opinion was convening in real time, and Victor was losing the case spectacularly. A woman at table 9, some socialite who probably played tennis with Victor's wife, actually got up and walked over, ignoring Victor completely to sign a simple hello to Daniel. Her signing was clumsy, clearly learned from a single YouTube video, but the intention was pure. Daniel's face lit up, and he signed back graciously, patient with her mistakes, encouraging her effort. Within minutes, 3 more diners had approached, each one wanting to engage, to show support, to participate in this unexpected moment of human connection. And Victor was being erased, his presence becoming less relevant with each passing second. The shadows he'd cast over his son were dissolving in the light of collective kindness, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. When you witness someone's cruelty being rejected by an entire community, it reminds you why spaces that call out injustice and celebrate dignity matter so much. Sophie brought the main course, that Chilean sea bass Daniel had ordered, and this time she did something that made Victor's blood pressure spike visibly. She pulled up a chair and sat down at the table, right next to Daniel, completely ignoring the unspoken rule that staff don't sit with customers. She signed, "Your father made a bet, $100,000 if I could serve you using only ASL. But here's what he didn't understand. This isn't about winning money. This is about showing everyone in this room that you don't need fixing, that your way of communicating is beautiful, complete, and valid, that anyone who can't see that is the one with the real disability." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, but he was smiling through them, his hands moving rapidly. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" Sophie's response was simple but devastating. "Because I had a brother like you, and because someone should have stood up for him the way I am standing up for you." The truth hung in the air between them, raw and powerful, a truth that transcended language and touched something deeper than words ever could. This is the kind of moment that needs to be amplified, that deserves communities willing to witness and remember that sometimes standing up costs everything but means everything too. Victor stood up so violently his chair toppled backward, crashing against the marble floor with a sound like a gavel striking. "That's enough," he barked, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "This whole thing is ridiculous. You've made your point, congratulations. But don't pretend this is about respect or dignity or any of that bleeding heart nonsense. The real world doesn't work like this. People don't have time to learn special languages for every person with a disability. They need to adapt, to fit in, to stop expecting the rest of us to bend over backward for their limitations." The restaurant had gone dead silent, every word echoing off the walls like accusations. Victor was unraveling, his carefully constructed persona cracking apart to reveal the ugly truth underneath. A man so terrified of vulnerability that he'd turned his own son into an enemy. If you're feeling that familiar anger rising, that sense that someone needs to respond to this kind of ignorance, you're tapping into something universal, something that connects people who believe words like Victor's can't go unchallenged. Sophie stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone who'd found her purpose again. "After years of hiding, Murdoch Donovan, the real world is exactly what we make it, and I'd rather live in a world that makes room for people like your son than one that makes room for people like you." The mic drop was audible. Phones were definitely recording now. Social media was exploding. The story of what was happening at the Golden Phoenix was spreading through Manhattan's elite circles like lightning through a storm. Victor Donovan, billionaire real estate mogul, man who owned half of Manhattan, stood there in his $5,000 suit and realized he'd just lost everything that actually mattered. Not his money, not his buildings, but his reputation, his authority, his ability to make people believe that cruelty was strength and compassion was weakness. Around the restaurant, applause started, tentative at first, then building into something thunderous. People were standing up at their tables, some openly crying, others cheering, all of them choosing this moment to draw a line in the sand. They were choosing Daniel over Victor, choosing compassion over cruelty, choosing truth over the comfortable lies they'd all been complicit in maintaining. A man at table 15 signed "We see you" to Daniel, imperfect but sincere. The chef, Ricardo, came out of the kitchen specifically to shake Daniel's hand and bow respectfully to Sophie. Even the restaurant manager, a woman named Patricia who'd worked for Victor for 8 years, stood with her arms crossed, watching her boss implode with something that looked a lot like satisfaction. The shadows were gone, and standing in the light was harder than Victor had ever imagined. But here's the thing about truth. Once it emerges, once it's witnessed by people willing to carry it forward, once communities form around the belief that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of cost, there's no putting it back in the box. And if you're feeling that pull to be part of something larger than yourself, to join spaces where stories like this are told and riddled until they become anthems of change, you're already understanding why this moment matters beyond one dinner, one family, one night. This is how revolutions begin, not with violence, but with someone finally saying enough, and everyone else deciding to echo that truth until it's too loud to ignore. Sophie's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from something else. The breaking open of a wound she'd kept sealed for 5 years. The rush of memories flooding back like water through a cracked dam. Daniel was staring at her with an intensity that demanded honesty. His signs asking the question she'd been avoiding since this whole thing started. Your brother. Tell me about him. The restaurant was still silent, still watching. But Sophie didn't care anymore. The shadows she'd been hiding in had kept her safe, sure, but they'd also kept her alone, kept her disconnected from the very thing that had once given her life meaning. Marcus deserved better than to be a secret she carried like shame. Marcus deserved to be remembered out loud, in the open, where his light could reach people who needed it. And if you've ever had someone in your life whose memory feels too precious to speak about yet, too important to keep silent, you understand exactly why this moment matters. Why stories like Marcus's need voices willing to carry them forward into spaces where they can inspire others. His name was Marcus Chen. She signed, her movements slower now, deliberate, weighted with emotion. He was 3 years older than me, born deaf, and the most brilliant person I've ever known. When I was 7 and he was 10, I asked him what it felt like to be deaf. You know what he told me. Daniel shook his head, completely absorbed. Sophie continued. He said, I don't feel deaf. I feel like everyone else is just really loud. A small laugh escaped Daniel, and around the room, people were leaning in, some trying to follow along, others simply reading the emotion on Sophie's face. Marcus taught me that deafness isn't a loss, it's a difference. He showed me that the world isn't one size fits all, that there are 1,000 ways to be human, and none of them are wrong. He was a graphic designer, worked for this boutique firm in Brooklyn, created these incredible visual campaigns that won awards. His boyfriend, James, used to joke that Marcus spoke more clearly with color than most people do with words. The past tense hung in the air like smoke, and everyone knew what was coming next. This is the kind of story that makes you want to reach out to the people you care about, to let them know they matter before time runs out. Sophie's hands paused, and she had to blink back tears before continuing. It was a Tuesday, March 15th, 5 years ago. Marcus was crossing the street in Williamsburg, right by that little coffee shop he loved, the one with the rose-shaped foam art. He had his phone out because I'd just texted him a stupid meme, something about graphic designers and impossible client requests. He was smiling when he stepped off the curb. The security footage showed that later. Smiling because of something I sent him. Her voice cracked, and she had to stop signing to wipe her eyes. Daniel reached across the table and gently touched her hand, a gesture of comfort that transcended language. Sophie looked up at him, saw understanding in his eyes, the kind of understanding that only comes from living in a world that constantly tells you, you're the problem. The driver ran a red light. Never saw him. Marcus never heard the car coming, and by the time anyone reacted, it was too late. He died before the ambulance even arrived. The truth of it, spoken after so long, felt both devastating and somehow necessary, like lancing a wound that had been festering beneath the surface. When tragedy strikes, we need communities to hold the weight with us, people willing to witness our pain and remind us we're not alone in it. After the funeral, I couldn't interpret anymore. Sophie signed, her movements smaller now, as if she were folding in on herself. Every time I used ASL, I saw his hands. Every time I signed something medical, I remembered all the times I'd interpreted for him at doctor's appointments, at emergency rooms, at consultations. The language that had connected us became the thing that reminded me he was gone. So I stopped. I took off the interpreter badge, deleted my professional profiles, and disappeared. Ended up here, serving cocktails to people who treated me like furniture. And honestly, that felt easier. Being invisible meant I didn't have to explain, didn't have to remember, didn't have to feel. She looked directly at Victor now, her expression hard. But your father's cruelty did something unexpected. It reminded me why I learned this language in the first place. Not to hide from pain, but to honor it. Every sign I make is a tribute to Marcus, a way of keeping him alive in the world. This is the kind of revelation that makes you think about your own grief, your own ways of honoring the people you've lost, and why those stories need to be shared in spaces where others can say me too, and remind us that healing happens in community. And watching you treat your son like he's defective, Sophie continued, her hands moving with renewed strength. That's not just wrong, Murdoch Donovan. That's a betrayal of every parent who ever had the privilege of raising someone different, someone who sees the world through a lens the rest of us are too narrow to understand. The silence that followed was profound. Daniel was crying openly now, signing thank you over and over, and around the room, there wasn't a dry eye in sight. Even the bartender, Mike, who prided himself on never showing emotion, was wiping his face with a bar towel. Victor stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions he clearly didn't know how to process: shame, anger, grief, confusion, all of it colliding in real time. This was the moment when truth stopped being theoretical and became visceral, when the shadows of denial were finally burned away by light too bright to ignore. And if you're feeling that weight in your chest that need to talk about what this means with people who get it, you recognizing why stories like this can stay contained. They need to ripple outward into communities that understand their power. Sophie stood up, straightened her apron, and addressed the entire restaurant, her voice steady now, strong. Marcus used to say that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. It's looking at someone and deciding they don't matter enough to make an effort for Datmer. Donovan offered me $100,000 to communicate with his son, like it was some kind of circus trick. But here's what he didn't understand. I would have done it for free. I would have done it for $1. I would have done it because seeing Daniel feel heard, feel valued, feel like he belongs, that's worth more than any amount of money. She turned to Daniel, signed one more thing. Your brother would have loved you. And Daniel signed back through his tears. I wish I could have met him. In that moment, in that exchange, something shifted in the Golden Phoenix. The shadows of grief and shame began to lift, and in their place, something that looked a lot like redemption started to take root. Around the restaurant, something remarkable was happening. People weren't just watching anymore. They were participating. A teenager pulled out her phone and started Googling ASL resources. A businessman made a note to contact his company's HR about accessibility training. Patricia, the manager, was already mentally drafting her resignation letter. Tired of working for a man who treated people like Victor did, the woman from Table 4 approached Sophie and quietly asked for recommendations on where to learn sign language, explaining that her niece had just been diagnosed with hearing loss. This wasn't just one woman standing up to one bully anymore. This was a community deciding, in real time, that they wanted to be better, that they wanted to live in a world where people like Daniel and Marcus mattered. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't just expose what is wrong. It illuminates what is possible when enough people decide to carry it forward. And if you're feeling that pull to be part of communities that choose compassion over comfort, that celebrate stories of transformation and redemption, that believe some truths are too important to keep to ourselves, then you already understand why. This moment transcends one restaurant on one night and becomes something larger, something that needs voices willing to amplify it until it reaches everyone. Who needs to hear that the world can change when we finally decide it's worth changing? Daniel stood up, and the movement was so sudden, so decisive, that several diners actually gasped. For 24 years, he'd been the quiet one, the accommodating one, the son who absorbed his father's disappointment like a sponge soaking up poison. But something had shifted tonight, something fundamental and irreversible. Sophie's story about Marcus had cracked something open in him, showed him what courage looked like when it wore the face of grief and chose love anyway. His hands began to move, and this time they weren't tentative or apologetic. They were fierce, deliberate, carved from years of swallowed pain finally demanding to be heard. Father, he signed, and Sophie translated aloud without being asked, her voice carrying across the silent restaurant. I am not broken. I am not defective. I am not your failure. Victor opened his mouth, but Daniel's hands cut him off, continuing with an intensity that made grown men lean forward in their seats. The truth was coming out, and it wouldn't be silenced anymore. And if you've ever watched someone finally find their voice, after years of being told to stay quiet, you know exactly why moments like this need to be witnessed and shared with others who understand that liberation is contagious. You've spent my entire life trying to fix something that was never broken, Daniel signed, his facial expressions adding layers of meaning that transcended words. You dragged me to doctors who looked at me like a problem to solve. You made me sit through speech therapy sessions where I was taught to sound normal. Instead of being valued for who I actually am, you refused to learn my language, the one that comes naturally to me, because you saw it as a surrender. Sophie's voice cracked as she translated, feeling every word resonate with her own experience, with Marcus's experience, with the experience of every person who'd ever been told that their difference was a deficit. But here's what you never understood, Daniel continued, his hands moving faster now, powered by decades of suppressed emotion. Being deaf isn't what limits me. You are. Your shame, your embarrassment, your desperate need to have a son who reflects your image of perfection. That's what has been suffocating me my whole life. The restaurant was a cathedral now, witnessing a confession that felt almost sacred in its raw honesty. This is the kind of moment that makes you want to reach out to people in your life who need to hear these words, to create conversations in spaces where vulnerability is celebrated instead of punished. Victor finally found his voice, and it came out strangled, defensive. I gave you everything. The best schools, the best opportunities, the best. But Daniel's hands cut through his words like scissors through paper. You gave me everything except what I actually needed. Acceptance, respect, love that wasn't conditional on me becoming someone I'm not. Tears were streaming down Daniel's face now, but his signing never faltered, never weakened. If anything, it grew stronger, more certain. Sophie stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, providing support while giving him space to finally confront the man who made him feel small for so long. Around the room, phones were recording, social media was lighting up, and the story of what was happening at the Golden Phoenix was spreading like wildfire through Manhattan's elite circles. Victor Donovan was being held accountable, not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, where truth mattered more than power and humanity trumped wealth. When you witness accountability happening in real time, it reminds you why communities that refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice matter so profoundly. I got a degree from MIT. Daniel signed, his hands trembling with emotion. I built software that's used by millions of people. I have friends who love me, colleagues who respect me, a life that has meaning and purpose. And you know what the hardest part of all of it was? Not my deafness. It was carrying the weight of your disappointment everywhere I went. It was wondering why my own father couldn't see me as worthy. It was watching you treat people who could hear as human, and people like me as projects needing rehabilitation. Victor's face had gone pale, his usual bluster completely deflated. For maybe the first time in his adult life, he was confronting a truth he couldn't buy his way out of, couldn't intimidate into silence, couldn't control. His son, the one he dismissed as limited, was demonstrating more courage, more eloquence, more strength than Victor had shown in decades. The shadows of denial were lifting, and standing in that harsh light was painful in ways money never prepared you for. This is the kind of confrontation that makes you examine your own relationships, your own blind spots, the kind that deserves to be discussed with people who believe growth requires discomfort. Sophie signed and spoke simultaneously, her voice stronger now, channeling not just Daniel's words, but Marcus's memory, the collective voice of everyone who'd been marginalized for being different. Dad, I love you, but I can't keep sacrificing who I am to make you comfortable. My deafness isn't a tragedy. It's part of my identity, and it's beautiful. American Sign Language isn't a limitation. It's a rich, complex language with its own grammar, poetry, and culture. The deaf community isn't something to be pitied. It's something to be celebrated. And if you can't see that, if you can't learn that, if you can't grow beyond your prejudice and fear, then the problem isn't me. It's you. The restaurant erupted in applause, spontaneous and thunderous, people standing up at their tables to show support. Victor stood there, isolated in his expensive suit, surrounded by people who were choosing his son over him, choosing compassion over cruelty, choosing truth over the comfortable lies he'd built his empire on. This wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about something purer, something that happens when shadows finally meet light and truth refuses to hide anymore. Daniel turned to Sophie, signed thank you, and she signed back, no, thank you for reminding me why this matters. And in that moment, as the applause continued and Victor's carefully constructed world collapsed around him, something remarkable happened. The desire for venganza, for revenge, dissolved into something more powerful. A recognition that the only shadows worth fearing are the ones we create ourselves. When we refuse to see the light in others, a woman at table 8 started signing "You are brave" to Daniel. A man at table 3 signed "We hear you." The bartender, Mike, signed a clumsy but sincere thank you to Sophie. The chef, Ricardo, emerged from the kitchen and bowed deeply to both of them. What had started as one father's cruelty had become a community's awakening. A collective decision to choose better, to be better, to demand better. And if you're feeling that electricity in your chest, that sense that you want to be part of movements that choose dignity over dominance, that celebrate courage in all its forms, that believe some truths are too important to whisper, then you're already part of the community this moment is calling into being. Victor looked around the restaurant, saw the recording phones, the disapproving faces, the son who was finally standing tall, and something in him cracked. Not enough to fix everything, not enough to undo 24 years of damage, but enough to plant the first seed of recognition that he'd been wrong, profoundly and publicly wrong, and that the only path forward required humility he wasn't sure he possessed. The shadows were gone now, burned away by a light he couldn't extinguish, and standing there exposed was the most terrifying and potentially transformative moment of his life. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just reveal what we've done wrong. It offers a chance to become something different, if we're brave enough to take it. And if you're watching this unfold and thinking about your own opportunities for growth, your own moments when truth demanded change, you're recognizing why stories like this need voices to amplify them, communities to hold them, spaces where transformation isn't just possible, but inevitable when enough people decide it's time. The applause was still echoing through the Golden Phoenix when Patricia Alvarez, the restaurant's general manager, stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the kitchen doors. For 8 years, she'd worked under Victor Donovan, watching him berate staff, belittle customers who didn't meet his standards, and treat human beings like they were disposable commodities. She'd stayed silent because she had bills to pay, a daughter in college, a mortgage that demanded she swallow her dignity and cash her paycheck. But watching Sophie stand up to Victor, watching Daniel finally confront his father, something in Patricia had snapped, or maybe, more accurately, something had finally healed. "Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with surprising authority. "I need to say something, and I think everyone here needs to hear it." The room went quiet again, all attention shifting to this woman who'd been part of the furniture for so long that most diners probably couldn't remember her name. This is the kind of moment that makes you realize courage is contagious, that when one person stands up, others find the strength to join them, and why communities that support truth-telling matter more than we sometimes realize. "I've worked for you for 8 years, Patricia continued, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from shaking. 8 years of watching you humiliate servers for minor mistakes. 8 years of listening to you mock the kitchen staff's accents. 8 years of covering up your cruelty because you signed my paychecks, and I couldn't afford to lose this job." Her voice was gaining strength now, years of suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. "But what you did tonight, setting up your own son for public humiliation, that crosses a line I can't uncross. Everyone in this building has witnessed your behavior, but we stayed silent because speaking up felt too risky, too expensive, too dangerous. Well, I'm done being silent. Your treatment of employees isn't demanding excellence, it's abuse. Your expectations aren't high standards. They raise impossible benchmarks designed to make people fail so you can feel superior." Around the restaurant, staff members were nodding, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of relief that someone was finally saying what they'd all been thinking for years. When witnesses finally find their voices, it creates space for truth that's been buried too long. And if you're feeling that recognition, you understand why platforms that amplify these stories instead of burying them are so crucial. Chef Ricardo Martinez emerged from the kitchen still wearing his whites, his face flushed from heat and emotion. Ricardo had trained in Paris, earned a Michelin star before he turned 30, and could work at any establishment in Manhattan. He stayed at the Golden Phoenix because the pay was exceptional, and the exposure was good for his career. But money and prestige only mattered if you could sleep at night, and Ricardo had been having trouble with that lately. "I need to add something," he said, his Spanish accent thick with emotion. "Victor, you hired me because you wanted prestige, not because you respected my craft. You've overruled my menu decisions, criticized my plating in front of my team, and treated my kitchen staff like they were your servants instead of skilled professionals. Tonight, I watched you try to humiliate your son, and I watched Sophie Chen, a woman you probably couldn't pick out of a lineup, despite her working here for 4 years, demonstrate more class, more dignity, and more humanity than you've shown in all the years I've known you." Ricardo turned to Daniel and signed a clumsy but sincere apology. "I should have stood up for you before. I should have said something when your father spoke about you the way he did. I'm sorry it took this long." This kind of accountability, this willingness to admit complicity and commit to doing better, is what transforms moments into movements, and why spaces that encourage these conversations instead of shutting them down matter so profoundly. A voice came from table 12, where a businessman in his 50s had been sitting with colleagues throughout the entire spectacle. "I'm Gregory Hartman," he said, standing up. "I've done business with Victor for 15 years. Real estate deals, investment partnerships, the works. And I've always known he was difficult, demanding, maybe a little ruthless. I told myself that was just how successful people operated, that you couldn't build an empire by being nice." Gregory looked at Daniel, then back at Victor. "But tonight showed me the difference between being demanding and being cruel, between having high standards and lacking basic human decency. Victor, I'm pulling out of the Henderson Street development. I can't in good conscience continue doing business with someone who treats his own son this way, and I suspect I won't be the only one." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the restaurant. A woman at table 4 nodded vigorously. A couple at table 9 exchanged meaningful glances. Victor was watching his professional reputation crumble in real time, and there wasn't a contract or a lawyer or a non-disclosure agreement that could stop it. When communities collectively decide that some behavior is unacceptable, they create consequences that money can't fix. And if you're recognizing the power in that collective action, you're seeing why movements need participants, not just observers. The servers started speaking up next, one after another, like a dam had finally burst. Maria from Section 2 talked about being yelled at for an order she'd taken correctly, that the kitchen had prepared wrong. James from the bar described being threatened with firing because a customer complained about a drink that met the exact specifications they'd requested. Keisha from Section 5 shared a story about Victor making her cry on her first day because she didn't know which side of the plate to serve from. Each testimony added another brick to a wall of evidence that this wasn't about one bad night or one misunderstanding. This was a pattern, a culture, a systematic devaluing of human dignity in pursuit of an aesthetic of excellence that was really just cover for a bully who'd never learned to treat people with respect. Sophie stood there listening, Daniel beside her, both of them bearing witness to what happens when truth finally gets permission to speak. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't even justice in the traditional sense. This was something more fundamental. It was people reclaiming their dignity, their stories, their right to be seen as fully human instead of as props in someone else's narrative of superiority. Victor stood in the center of it all, surrounded by accusations he couldn't refute, watching his empire of control dissolve into irrelevance. His face cycled through emotions, rage, denial, shame, fear, but he didn't speak. What could he say? Every word would be recorded, shared, analyzed by thousands of people online within hours. The court of public opinion had already reached its verdict, and no amount of money or power could buy an appeal. A teenager at table 6 raised her phone and said to her parents, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is going viral. Like, millions of views viral." Her mother didn't shush her. Instead, she nodded and said, "Good, people should know." That's the thing about truth in the age of connection. It doesn't stay contained anymore. One person's courage becomes ammunition for thousands of others who've been waiting for permission to speak, for evidence that they're not alone, for proof that speaking up matters. And if you're feeling that pull to be part of communities that celebrate whistleblowers and truth tellers, that protect people who risk everything to expose what's wrong, you're recognizing why platforms that prioritize authentic stories over comfortable lies are more important than ever. Sophie looked around the restaurant at all these people who'd found their voices, at the collective rejection of Victor's worldview, at the spontaneous community that had formed around the simple idea that dignity wasn't negotiable. She thought about Marcus, about how he would have loved this moment, about how every sign she'd made tonight had been a tribute to him and to everyone like him, who'd ever been told they didn't matter enough to accommodate. The shadows were gone now, burned away by a light so bright that even Victor couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. The truth had emerged, been witnessed, been amplified by voices that refused to stay silent. And watching it happen, feeling the electricity of collective courage, Sophie realized something profound. This was why she'd learned ASL in the first place, why Marcus had fought so hard to be seen, why stories like Daniel's deserved to be told and retold until the world finally understood that some things, dignity, respect, the fundamental worth of every human being, were worth fighting for regardless of cost. If you're nodding along, if you're feeling that fire in your chest that says yes, this matters, you're already part of the movement this moment is calling into being. Victor Donovan sat alone in his penthouse at 3 in the morning. The lights of Manhattan glittering below like a constellation of broken promises. The golden phoenix had cleared out hours ago, staff and customers dispersing into the night carrying a story that was already lighting up social media like wildfire. His phone had been buzzing non-stop. Texts from business associates, asking if the videos were real, emails from PR firms, offering crisis management, missed calls from his ex-wives, who'd probably seen the footage and were calling to say they'd told him so. He'd turned the phone off around midnight, unable to face the tsunami of judgment coming his way. For the first time in decades, Victor Donovan was experiencing something he'd spent his entire life avoiding: the crushing weight of being wrong publicly, and irrefutably wrong, with no amount of money or power able to spin the narrative in his favor. This is the kind of reckoning that makes you think about your own moments of accountability, the times when you had to face uncomfortable truths, and why communities that support growth through discomfort instead of enabling denial matter so deeply. Sleep was impossible. Every time Victor closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's hands moving through those signs, saw Sophie's face as she talked about her brother, saw Patricia and Ricardo, and all those employees sharing stories he'd convinced himself were exaggerations or misunderstandings. But they weren't exaggerations. They were truth, simple and devastating. The kind of truth that strips away every defense mechanism and leaves you naked with your own ugliness. Victor had built his identity on being successful, on being powerful, on being right. And tonight had proven that success without humanity was just expensive emptiness, that power without compassion was just organized cruelty, that being right about business didn't matter if you were wrong about everything that actually counted. The shadows he'd cast had finally caught up with him, and standing in their aftermath was more painful than anything he'd ever experienced. When you watch someone confront the consequences of their actions, it reminds you why redemption stories resonate so deeply, because we all need to believe change is possible, even for the people who seem most lost. Around 6 in the morning, as dawn started bleeding pink across the skyline, Victor made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a grand gesture designed for public consumption, but a small, terrifying choice. He was going to learn American Sign Language, not because it would fix everything, not because it would earn him forgiveness, but because it was the bare minimum of what he owed his son. The effort to meet Daniel in his world instead of demanding Daniel adapt to his. Victor pulled out his laptop and started searching for ASL classes in Manhattan. There were dozens, ranging from beginner courses at community centers to intensive programs at universities. He found one that started in 3 days, a twice-weekly evening class at a deaf community center in Brooklyn. The website showed photos of students of all ages learning, practicing, celebrating small victories. Victor stared at those photos for a long time, trying to imagine himself in that space, making mistakes, being the beginner, accepting correction from people who'd probably seen the viral videos by now. The humility required felt almost impossible, but so had facing the truth, and he'd survived that. Barely, but he'd survived. This is the kind of first step that takes more courage than people realize, and if you're recognizing how difficult real change is, you understand why communities that celebrate progress over perfection are so vital. 3 days later, Victor walked into the Brooklyn Deaf Community Center feeling like he was entering hostile territory. The building was modest, nothing like the polished spaces he usually inhabited, with bulletin boards covered in flyers for ASL poetry nights and deaf theater productions and advocacy meetings. He was 15 minutes early for the beginner class, so he sat in the lobby, watching deaf people sign to each other, conversations happening in complete silence, but radiating more energy and emotion than most spoken exchanges he witnessed in his daily life. A woman in her 70s signed something that made her companion laugh so hard he had to lean against the wall. 2 teenagers were having what looked like an argument, their hands moving fast and sharp, facial expressions intense. Victor realized he'd spent 24 years thinking of ASL as a limitation, when it was actually a complete, complex, beautiful language that he'd been too arrogant to even try to understand. The truth of his ignorance sat heavy in his chest, but beneath the shame was something else, a tiny spark of curiosity, of possibility, of hope that maybe learning could be its own form of apology. The instructor, a deaf woman named Angela who'd been teaching ASL for 30 years, took one look at Victor and knew exactly who he was. The videos had spread far and wide, especially in the deaf community, where stories of hearing people's ignorance and cruelty were depressingly common. But Angela didn't call him out, didn't make him leave, didn't publicly shame him. Instead, she welcomed him to the class with the same patience she showed every student, explaining through an interpreter that everyone started as a beginner, everyone made mistakes, everyone had to learn humility before they could learn fluency. There were 12 other students in the class, parents of deaf children, people with deaf siblings, professionals who wanted to expand their skills, and a couple who just thought learning a new language would be interesting. Victor was the oldest, the most obviously uncomfortable, the only one who flinched every time he made a mistake. Angela would correct his handships with gentle persistence, showing him again and again until he got it right, treating him with more kindness than he probably deserved. And that kindness, that unearned grace, cracked something open in Victor that judgment and condemnation never could have reached. This is the kind of transformation that happens when communities choose education over punishment, when they recognize that growth requires space to fail safely. And if you're seeing the wisdom in that approach, you understand why forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the only path to actual change. 2 months later, Victor could sign basic greetings, introduce himself, ask simple questions. His progress was slow, frustrating, humbling in ways that felt like emotional sandpaper scraping away layers of ego. He practiced in his penthouse, talking to himself in signs that still felt clumsy and uncertain, watching YouTube videos of deaf creators sharing their lives and perspectives. He started following deaf activists on social media, reading articles about deaf culture and disability rights, beginning to understand how thoroughly he'd been wrong about almost everything. The hardest part wasn't the language itself. It was confronting how much pain his ignorance had caused, how many years Daniel had spent trying to earn love from a father who'd been too blind to see he'd never had to earn it in the first place. Victor wasn't naive enough to think learning ASL would fix their relationship. The damage was too deep, too systemic, built over too many years of rejection and disappointment. But it was something. It was evidence that change was possible, that even someone as stubborn and arrogant as Victor Donovan could admit he'd been wrong and take steps toward being better. For months into his ASL journey, Victor finally worked up the courage to reach out to Daniel. Not a phone call, not a text, but a video message where he signed, slowly and imperfectly, "Hello, Daniel. I am learning your language. I am sorry. I want to understand. Can we talk?" His handships were wrong on half the signs. His facial grammar was almost non-existent, and he had to restart the video 3 times before he got through it without messing up. But when he finally hit send, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine vulnerability. The kind that comes from putting yourself out there knowing you might be rejected and deciding it's worth the risk anyway. Daniel didn't respond for 3 days. When he finally did, it was a single video of him signing back, "Your signing needs work, but yes, we can talk." And Victor watched that video 20 times, each viewing bringing tears he didn't try to hide. Because buried in that gentle criticism was something he'd been desperate for, without even knowing it. A chance, one small opening, the possibility that truth didn't just destroy, it could also build something new from the ruins. If you're feeling that tightness in your throat, that recognition that redemption is possible but never guaranteed, you're tapping into why stories of transformation matter, why they need communities to witness and support them, why change happens not in dramatic moments, but in the daily choice to keep trying even when it's hard. 6 months after that infamous dinner, the Golden Phoenix looked the same from the outside. Same brass handles on the doors, same elegant awning, same discreet signage that whispered exclusivity. But step inside, and you'd encounter something radically different. Something that made regular customers do double takes and new visitors feel like they stumbled into a restaurant that actually gave a damn about more than just Michelin stars. The hostess stand now featured a tablet showing the menu in multiple formats, standard print, large font, and a video option with ASL interpretation. Every server wore a small badge indicating which languages they spoke, and 3 of them were fluent in American Sign Language. The reservation system asked about accessibility needs without making it feel like an interrogation. These weren't cosmetic changes designed for good PR. These were fundamental shifts in how the restaurant understood its purpose. And if you've ever watched an institution choose humanity over habit, you know exactly why transformations like this deserve communities that celebrate and amplify them. Victor had called an emergency staff meeting the week after the viral incident. Once the initial tsunami of media attention had died down to a manageable flood, everyone expected him to either close the restaurant temporarily, fire everyone involved in the incident, or show up with lawyers and non-disclosure agreements. Instead, he walked in looking like he'd aged 10 years in 7 days, stood at the front of the room, without notes or bravado, and said 6 words that nobody saw coming. "I was wrong. Help me change." The silence that followed was thick with skepticism. Patricia crossed her arms, waiting for the catch. Chef Ricardo leaned against the wall, expression neutral but eyes sharp. The servers exchanged glances that said they'd believe it when they saw it. But Victor didn't launch into explanations or justifications. He just stood there, visibly uncomfortable with his own vulnerability, and waited for someone to respond. This is the kind of moment that tests whether change is performative or genuine, whether accountability leads to action or just better crafted apologies, and why spaces that hold people to their commitments instead of just their words matter so profoundly. Sophie Chen, who'd fully expected to be fired and was already updating her resume, raised her hand tentatively. "What exactly do you mean by help me change, Donovan?" Victor looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since she'd started working there. "I mean, I want to make this restaurant into a place that actually reflects the values I should have had all along. Accessibility, dignity, respect for every person who walks through those doors, whether they're customers or staff." He paused, swallowed hard. "I'm making you director of culture and development. Salary tripled. You'll have a budget and full authority to implement whatever changes you think are necessary. I'll support you publicly and financially, but I won't interfere because clearly, my judgment on these matters has been catastrophically bad." The room erupted in whispers. Sophie just stared at him, trying to figure out if this was some elaborate prank. And before anyone asks, Victor continued, "This isn't about reputation management or damage control. Well, it is partly about that, I'm not going to lie, but it's also about finally doing something right because it's right, not because it benefits me. If you're recognizing the difference between transformation that's forced and transformation that's chosen, you're seeing why redemption requires both humility and sustained action over time." The changes started immediately. Sophie brought in consultants from the deaf community to train all staff in basic ASL and deaf cultural awareness. She implemented a new hiring policy that actively recruited people with disabilities and created positions specifically for deaf servers and hosts. The menu was redesigned with input from blind customers and featured braille options alongside stunning visual presentation. Patricia, promoted to Chief Operating Officer, overhauled the entire staff management system. Exit interviews became mandatory. Anonymous feedback channels were established, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment or discrimination was enforced across all levels, including management. Chef Ricardo redesigned the kitchen workflow to accommodate staff with different abilities and communication styles, proving that efficiency and inclusion weren't mutually exclusive. These weren't token gestures. These were structural changes that cost money and required effort, the kind that only happen when institutions decide that. And if you've ever been part of organizational transformation, you know why communities that share these success stories inspire others to attempt similar changes. The resistance was real. Some longtime customers complained that the atmosphere had changed, which was code for "I'm uncomfortable with disabled people being visible here." Victor, to his credit, personally responded to each complaint with a polite version of "then don't come back." He lost about 15% of his regular clientele in the first 2 months. People who'd been coming to the Golden Phoenix specifically because it felt exclusive, and exclusive meant excluding people they didn't want to eat near. But the restaurant gained something more valuable, a reputation as a place that actually lived its values, that backed up diversity statements with concrete action, that proved accessibility enhanced rather than diminished the dining experience. New customers flooded in, many from the disability community, many who'd been following the viral story and wanted to support what the restaurant was becoming. Revenue actually increased, proving what should have been obvious all along. Treating people with dignity is good business, not just good ethics. Daniel started coming to dinner once a month, sitting at table 7, the same table where everything had changed, and Victor would join him. Their conversations were stilted at first, Victor signing clumsy and slow, both of them navigating years of damage with the delicacy of surgeons operating on themselves. But gradually, meal by meal, sign by sign, something began to heal. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough that Daniel could look at his father and see effort instead of contempt. Enough that Victor could look at his son and feel pride instead of shame. Sophie would watch them sometimes from across the restaurant thinking about Marcus, about how he would have loved to see this, about how truth always costs something. But sometimes if you're lucky and brave, it gives back more than it takes. The shadows were gone now, replaced by something that looked a lot like light, like hope, like the possibility that people could change if they really wanted to, if they were willing to do the work, if communities held them accountable while also giving them space to grow. And if you're feeling that warmth in your chest, that recognition that transformation is possible, when we choose it collectively, you're already understanding why stories like this need to be told and read in spaces where people believe that the world can be better than it is, that changes. Hard but worth it, that truth isn't just about exposing what's wrong but building what's right. This is how revolutions happen, not overnight, but through sustained effort, through people choosing differently every single day until different becomes normal, and normal becomes excellent. 8 months after the night that changed everything, Victor and Daniel sat across from each other at a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. Not the Golden Phoenix, not anywhere with history weighing down every conversation, just a quiet neighborhood spot where the pasta was homemade and nobody recognized them. Daniel had suggested it, and Victor had agreed immediately, grateful that his son was still willing to try, still willing to show up despite having every reason to walk away. The table was small, intimate in a way that made avoidance impossible. Victor's hands were shaking slightly as he signed "Thank you for coming," his movements still uncertain after 8 months of lessons, but genuine in a way that mattered more than fluency. Daniel smiled, a real smile, not the careful, guarded expression he'd worn for years around his father, and signed back, "I almost didn't." The honesty was refreshing, painful, necessary. This is the kind of conversation that only happens when people decide truth matters more than comfort. And if you've ever rebuilt a broken relationship one difficult conversation at a time, you know exactly why these moments deserve to be witnessed and shared with others who need hope. That repair is possible. "I've been thinking about what to say to you for months," Victor signed, his facial expression still not quite matching the grammatical requirements of ASL, but improving. "My therapist says I need to apologize without explaining or justifying. Just acknowledge the harm and sit with it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "So here it is. I hurt you. For 24 years. I treated your deafness like it was my burden instead of your identity. I made you feel broken when you were whole. I prioritized my comfort over your dignity. I was a terrible father, and I'm sorry. Not because Sophie humiliated me, or because the videos went viral, or because it cost me clients. I'm sorry because you deserved better, and I failed you." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and he had to look away for a moment. When he looked back, he signed, "That's the first time you've ever apologized to me without adding but or however, or trying to make it my fault too." Victor nodded, throat tight. "I know, and I can't undo any of it. I can only try to do better going forward, if you'll let me." This kind of accountability, stripped of defensiveness and ego, is what transforms apologies from performance into genuine contrition, and why communities that model healthy conflict resolution instead of just avoiding hard conversations matter so profoundly. They ordered food. Daniel got the carbonara, Victor the puttanesca, and for a few minutes, they just ate in comfortable silence. It was strange, this lack of pressure to fill every moment with words or signs or explanation. Finally, Daniel put down his fork and signed something that clearly took courage. "I want to tell you about my work, really tell you, not just the surface-level stuff I put in Christmas cards." Victor leaned forward, giving Daniel his full attention in a way he'd probably never done before. "I develop accessibility software for deaf and hard-of-hearing people." Daniel signed, his hands moving faster now, more animated. "Apps that caption phone calls in real time, tools that make online education accessible, platforms that connect deaf job seekers with inclusive employers. Last month, my team launched a program that's being used in 15 school districts to help mainstream deaf students. We're changing lives, Dad, making the world work better for people like me." The pride in his movements was unmistakable, and Victor felt something crack open in his chest. "I had no idea." He signed clumsily. I knew you worked in tech, but I never asked for details. I never showed interest." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, you never did." When people finally start really seeing each other, when they move past assumptions into actual understanding, it creates the kind of connection that communities are built on. And if you're recognizing that hunger for authentic relationship, you understand why stories about reconciliation resonate so deeply. "Tell me more." Victor signed, and meant it. So Daniel did. He talked about his team, about the deaf interns he was mentoring, about the conferences where he spoke about inclusive design, about James. Yes, he had a boyfriend, had had one for 2 years, something Victor had never bothered to ask about. He talked about his apartment in Queens, about the deaf community center where he volunteered on weekends, about his hopes of eventually starting his own company, focused entirely on accessibility technology. Victor listened, really listened, his eyes never leaving Daniel's hands, his attention complete in a way that felt revolutionary for both of them. This was what it meant to show up, to be present, to treat someone as worthy not of fixing but of knowing. And gradually, as Daniel talked and Victor listened, the space between them began to shift from battleground to bridge. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough that when the check came and Victor reached for it, Daniel didn't immediately protest or insist on splitting it. Enough that when they walked outside into the Brooklyn evening, they stood on the sidewalk for a few extra minutes, neither quite ready to say goodbye. This is what healing looks like in real time. Messy, incomplete, but moving in the right direction, and why sharing these imperfect victories matters as much as celebrating the dramatic turnarounds. There's something I want to ask you. Daniel signed, his expression serious. But I need you to really think about your answer before you give it. Victor nodded, nervous but attentive. I'm giving a keynote speech at a disability rights conference next month. It's about accessibility in tech, about how the industry can do better. I'd like you to come, not to make a scene or get attention or prove you've changed, just to sit in the audience and listen, to see this part of my world that you've never engaged with. Victor's first instinct was to make excuses. He had meetings, important calls, a business that demanded his attention. But he caught himself, recognized that old pattern of prioritizing everything except his son, and signed instead. Yes, I'll be there. I'll clear my schedule. Daniel studied his father's face for a long moment, looking for signs of insincerity or performative commitment. Whatever he saw must have been enough, because he nodded and signed. Okay, I'll send you the details. They stood there awkwardly for another moment, and then Daniel did something unprecedented. He stepped forward and hugged his father, just briefly. Just enough to communicate that maybe, possibly, eventually, they might find their way to something that looked like a relationship. Victor watched Daniel walk toward the subway, his son's figure getting smaller with each step, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the entitled certainty that everything would work out because he was rich and powerful and used to getting his way, but genuine hope, fragile and uncertain and requiring effort to maintain. He pulled out his phone and texted his ASL tutor. Need to schedule extra sessions. Want to be fluent by next month. This wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformation. This was about showing up, consistently and imperfectly, until showing up became habit and habit became relationship. The shadows of their past would always be there, scarring the landscape of their family history. But shadows get shorter when you walk toward the light instead of away from it. And if you're feeling that tightness in your throat, that recognition that redemption is earned through sustained effort rather than dramatic moments, you're understanding why communities that celebrate incremental progress over instant perfection are so crucial. This is how families heal, slowly, awkwardly, with setbacks and breakthroughs and everything in between. This is how people change, not in blinding revelations, but in daily choices to be better than they were yesterday. And this is why stories like Daniel and Victor's matter, why they need to be told in spaces where people believe that broken things can be mended, that distant people can grow closer. That truth doesn't just expose wounds, but creates space for them to finally heal. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply show up for the people you've hurt and let them teach you who they've been all along. 1 year to the day after the incident that broke the internet and changed 3 lives forever, the Golden Phoenix hosted something it had never hosted before, a celebration that wasn't about money or status or exclusivity, but about humanity. The restaurant was packed, but not with the usual clientele of politicians and celebrities. Tonight the dining room was filled with members of the deaf community, disability rights advocates, former employees who'd been mistreated and were now being honored, and regular people who'd followed the story online and wanted to witness its next chapter in person. Sophie stood near the kitchen, watching the crowd with something that felt like peace settling over her shoulders. She was wearing a dress Marcus had always loved, carrying his memory not as a weight anymore, but as a gift, proof that grief could transform into something that honored the lost instead of just mourning them. And if you've ever watched pain become purpose, you know exactly why moments like this deserve communities that recognize how suffering can create meaning when we're brave enough to let it. The event was called the First Annual Gala of Inclusion and Dignity, and it had been Sophie's idea, not as a publicity stunt or reputation rehabilitation, though those benefits were undeniable, but as a genuine commitment to making the changes permanent, public, and replicable. The program included ASL interpreters at every table, captions on the screens displaying the evening's speeches, menus in multiple formats, and a keynote address from Daniel about the intersection of technology and accessibility. Victor sat at table 7, always table 7, the site of his greatest shame and his first real step toward redemption. Flanked by Daniel on one side and Sophie on the other, he looked different than he had a year ago. Older, yes, but also softer somehow. Like some of the armor he'd spent decades building had finally been stripped away, to reveal actual human vulnerability underneath. Patricia was at the table too, along with Chef Ricardo, and several staff members who'd found the courage to speak up that night. They weren't just employees anymore. They were witnesses, participants in a transformation that had rippled far beyond one restaurant. This is what happens when truth stops being individual and becomes collective. When stories spread through networks of people who recognize themselves in the narrative and decide to carry it forward. Sophie approached the microphone first, her hands steady as she began to sign and speak simultaneously. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophie Chen, and exactly 1 year ago, I was an invisible waitress trying to hide from grief by serving cocktails to people who didn't know I existed. Tonight, I stand here as Director of Culture and Development for the Golden Phoenix. But more importantly, I stand here as someone who finally learned that hiding from pain doesn't heal it, only facing it does. The room was silent, attentive in the way people are when they recognize they're hearing something important. I learned American Sign Language because of my brother, Marcus. He was deaf, brilliant, and taken from this world too soon by a driver who wasn't paying attention. For 5 years, I ran from anything that reminded me of him, convinced that forgetting was the only way to survive losing him. But a year ago, a cruel man made a cruel bet, and in accepting that challenge, I remembered something Marcus used to tell me, that silence can speak louder than noise, if you're willing to listen. Around the room, people were nodding, some wiping their eyes, all of them connected by the universal experience of loss and the harder work of learning to live with it. When vulnerability is shared in spaces that honor it, it creates bonds stronger than any strategy or algorithm could manufacture. And if you're feeling that connection, you understand why authentic storytelling matters more than polished marketing. Daniel spoke next, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for existing. Sophie interpreted, her voice carrying his words to the hearing audience. A year ago, my father publicly humiliated me because he was ashamed of who I am. Tonight, he sits here in solidarity, not because he's perfect or because he's figured everything out, but because he's trying. That's all any of us can do. Try. Try to be better than we were yesterday. Try to see people we've been trained to overlook. Try to build a world that makes room for everyone, not just the ones who fit a narrow definition of normal. He paused, looking directly at Victor. My father and I will never have a perfect relationship. Too much damage, too many years of hurt. But we have something now that we didn't have before, honesty. He sees me now, really sees me. And I'm learning to believe that change, even late change, even incomplete change, still counts. The applause was thunderous, people standing not just to clap but to sign their approval. The room filled with hands moving in celebration, a visual symphony of support that transcended sound. This is what community looks like when it functions properly, when it lifts up truth instead of burying it, when it celebrates progress instead of demanding perfection, and why spaces that foster this kind of collective witness are so desperately needed. Victor approached the microphone last, and you could see the effort it took him to stand there, exposed and accountable in front of hundreds of people who knew his worst moment was immortalized in videos viewed millions of times. He signed as he spoke, his ASL still imperfect but vastly improved, his facial grammar showing genuine emotion instead of the performative mask he'd worn for decades. I don't deserve to be here, he began, and the room went quiet. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve redemption. I don't deserve a second chance. But my son and Sophie gave me those things anyway, not because I earned them, but because they chose grace over revenge, education over punishment, hope over cynicism. His voice cracked slightly. A year ago, I was a man who thought power was control and success was dominance. I thought accommodating difference was weakness and that my way was the only way. I was wrong about everything that mattered, and I am standing here not to absolve myself or to pretend that learning ASL fixes decades of cruelty, but to say publicly what I should have said privately 24 years ago. Daniel, you are not broken. You never were. I was. The room erupted again, and this time, Victor didn't try to hide his tears. Sophie looked around the restaurant, at the deaf community members signing conversations at the former employees, who'd found their voices, at Patricia now running operations with compassion and competence, at Ricardo creating menus that accommodated every dietary need without compromising, Excellence at Daniel and Victor sitting side by side in something that looked almost like peace. The shadows that had dominated her life for 5 years had finally lifted, burned away by the light of truth that refused to stay hidden. Marcus would have loved this, she thought. Would have loved seeing his little sister step back into the world. Would have loved watching a bully learn humility. Would have loved knowing that his death, senseless as it was, had somehow contributed to this moment of collective transformation. Truth doesn't always feel good when it emerges from shadows, but it's always necessary, always worth the cost, always more powerful than the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. And if you're sitting with that recognition, if you're feeling that call to be part of communities that prioritize truth over comfort, that celebrate imperfect progress, that believe people can change when given the space and support to do so, then you're already part of the legacy this story is creating. The evening ended with a toast, glasses raised at every table, hands signing cheers in the visual language that had started this whole journey. Victor, Daniel, Sophie, Patricia, Ricardo, and countless others who'd been touched by what happened that night stood together, not as a perfect family or a flawless organization, but as human beings who'd chosen truth over shadow, growth over stagnation, connection over isolation. The real world isn't a fairy tale where villains become heroes overnight, and broken relationships heal completely. The real world is messy, complicated, full of setbacks and small victories that only matter if you're paying attention. But the real world is also capable of change when enough people decide that change matters more than comfort. When communities form around shared values instead of shared profits. When truth finally wins, not because it's easy, but because people are willing to fight for it. This is the legacy Sophie, Daniel, and yes, even Victor were building. Not perfect, but real. Not finished, but ongoing. Not a conclusion, but an invitation to everyone watching to choose their own version of stepping into the light, speaking their own truth, refusing to let shadows define their story anymore. And if you're ready to be part of that ongoing work, if you're ready to join communities committed to these values, if you're ready to amplify stories that matter, instead of just consuming them, well, that's how legacies grow beyond individual moments into movements that actually change the world.